Robert Nanima. I'm a member of the committee, the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and I'm also the Special Rapporteur for children affected by armed conflict, and also the chairperson of the working group on the implementation of decisions. In my other life, I'm an associate professor at the University of the Western Cape at the Faculty of Law, where I lecture child justice and law of evidence, among others.
Could you tell us what the definition of a child is in international law?
There are different definitions depending on which specific international human rights instrument you're looking at. For the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's any person who is below the age of 18, unless the national law provides for an earlier age. So it's not a straight 18 definition. For the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, it's the straight 18 definition. So a child is any person below the age of 18. So in the African context, and for all countries that have ratified the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, a child is anyone below the age of 18.
In your experience, what are some of the common misconceptions that people have about the experiences of children in armed conflict situations?
That's a great question. The first misconception is that children affected by armed conflict are only in spaces of armed conflict. We always think only where there are bullets flying, spaces of armed conflict, that's where they are. But even from the theaters of conflict, these children are affected and they move to other spaces. For instance, they move to spaces where there are places of transition as refugee children or internally displaced children, or where they actually move to places where they settle in peaceful societies. So whether it's a peaceful society or whether it's an area where a child is in transition or is internally displaced or as a refugee, all those could be children affected. What matters is the severity of the effect depending on where they are and what states or stakeholders should do to promote and protect the rights of those children by virtue of the fact that they remain affected where they are. So that's the first misconception. So there are different environments. It could be a peaceful environment. It could be an environment of transition. It could be an environment where there is actual armed conflict. And we look at armed conflict in a grand perspective. It's not only where there is actual armed conflict, but where there is armed conflict, where there is tension, for instance, gangs are fighting, where there is strife, for instance, where there is election violence. All that could amount to what we categorize as armed conflict. So these children could be in any space, provided there is that common denominator that at one time they were in an area that had armed conflict. The second misconception is to think that children are homogeneous, that a child in armed conflict is the same as a child who is in a peaceful state. Now, that's not the case. A child in armed conflict will require different measures, different interventions that speak to the improvement of his or her person. And if we don't realize that, we shall treat all of them the same. Or at times we shall discriminate against them by virtue of the fact that they're coming from somewhere else. The third misconception is the fact that we always say or think that since the children are from areas of armed conflict, they are not children. They are adults, especially in instances where they are linked to terrorism or terrorist activities. And we feel that until we deal with them with the strongest arm of the law, we're not dealing with them correctly. The common denominator, they remain children, should be dealt with as children first, as victims first, before other aspects kick in.
Could you highlight to us what are some of the effective strategies that we can employ in order to protect and support children who are affected by armed conflict, both before, during, and after the conflict?
The greatest strategy is to place this child affected by armed conflict at the center of any intervention, whether it is a state intervention, whether it's an intervention by CSOs, or whether it's an intervention by the non-state actors themselves, whether it's an intervention by other stakeholders. Place the child at the center, look at the challenges that this child presents, then deal with those challenges from the perspective of your strengths as a stakeholder. As a CSO, what are you bringing on board? Or as various CSOs, what are you bringing on board? In doing so, you are able to save resources but at the same time deal with the specific aspects that the child is dealing with. So that is the general strategy that should be seen to work across. But from a specific perspective, armed conflict has to be dealt with not only at the beginning, not only during, and not only at the end. It's a continuum. So the aspect of demobilization comes to the fore. At what point do we demobilize these children? The aspect of disarmament comes to the fore. After disarmament, what happens? The greatest of the three for me is reintegration. At what point do we start the reintegration? At what point do we stop? It's not something that can be done in a year or two. It's something that requires preparing the child, preparing the family where the child is going back to, preparing the community that's going to receive the child, preparing the state to be able to receive the children, preparing the CSOs that are supporting this child. So it's a great continuum that requires resources, that requires deliberate efforts that look at the specific requirements of this child. We have had instances where children are taken back to the community and the mothers, the parents say, no, we're not ready to have them. These children killed people. We have had instances where we take back children, but they later go back to armed conflict because they see there are better options out there. So the DDR process is very instructive, but as how we deal with it, it cannot be an objective answer. It is objective and subjective in the sense that we look at the demands, the requirements that this child needs, that the community needs, that the family needs, that the state needs. But at its core, you place this child at the center of any interventions that you're putting across, and those interventions should inform what you intend to do in terms of strategy.